Every generation of Dodge Charger built since 1964 gets covered here, start to finish, because this is the muscle car that America's own government, its own parent company, and its own sales charts tried to kill 3 separate times, and it never once stayed dead. I went through the full production history across 8 distinct generations and more than 4 decades of sales data, buyer's guides, and factory records to put this together. Here's the number that shows exactly who Dodge built this car for. By 1968, the median Charger buyer was just 30 years old, a full 20 years younger than the typical Dart, Coronet, Polara, or Monaco buyer. Proof this car had found exactly the young, restless buyer Dodge was chasing. The story you've probably heard is that muscle cars died in the 1970s and never really came back, choked out by insurance premiums and emissions rules. But the Charger didn't die. It got canceled in the late 1970s and came back. It got canceled again in 1987 and came back again. And in 2022, tightening EPA emissions rules forced Dodge's hand a third time. Here's what should stop you cold. Of the slightly more than 710,000 Chargers built in just the nameplate's original 13 years, a huge share are gone now, crushed, rusted, or converted into something else. And the ones that survive in top condition are worth more than most Americans' houses were worth when the car was new. And I'm saving one story for last, the one about a factory sedan. 4 doors, a trunk big enough for the groceries, that Dodge built with enough horsepower to embarrass cars costing 4 times as much. That's the ending. Let's start with the part almost nobody knows. The Charger you love almost wasn't a Charger at all. It was a lie Dodge told to its own customers. Picture a Chrysler design studio in 1964, sketches taped to the walls, and a decision already made, quietly, behind closed doors, while the public was told nothing had been decided at all. The car in question started life that year as a Dodge Polara-based show car wearing the name Charger for the very first time. It was a fastback, upscale, styled to test whether America wanted a performance coupe wrapped in something classier than a stripped-down muscle machine. Dodge took it on the auto show circuit in 1965. And here's the part that changes how you see the whole nameplate. The design was already approved. Internally, the record shows the company built what it called a Charger idea car, displayed it to the public, and let the press believe it was nothing more than a concept, floated only to gauge interest, something the company might build if they liked it. One period account lays out the strategy in plain language. We built a Charger idea car, which we displayed at auto shows in 1965 to stimulate market interest in the concept. It was the approved design, but we told the press and auto show attendees that it was just an idea, and that we would build it if they liked it. It was theater. The decision had already been made. The public just didn't know they were being used to rubber stamp a car that already existed on paper. While that theater played out, Dodge was also testing the name itself on a smaller scale. In 1965, the Dart GT got a high-performance package badged the Dart Charger, sometimes called the Charger 273 for its 273 cubic inch V8, and only about 480 of them were built. It wasn't meant to last. It was a trial balloon, a way to see if buyers responded to the word Charger attached to a hot small car before Dodge committed real money to a standalone model. That whole 1964 concept had one eye on Ford's new Mustang the entire time, aiming to be cheap and fun enough to steal some of that car's thunder, even as the styling direction kept shifting under it. The man shaping the direction of that eventual standalone model was Carl Cam Cameron, the Chrysler studio designer credited with the first production Charger's fastback roofline and its electric shaver grille with rotating headlights. Bill Brownlee, who would go on to oversee 3 full generations of the car, was already inside that same design apparatus, watching the idea take shape. By 1966, the show car theater was over. The Dart Charger package quietly ended, and Dodge had committed, fully, publicly, to building a standalone model carrying a name it had already field tested twice under false pretenses. The public thought they'd asked for the Charger, Dodge had decided to build it long before they answered. That's how the Charger was born, out of a calculated deception dressed up as market research. What happened when that idea finally hit real Dodge showrooms was a lot quieter than anyone at the company expected. The Charger's actual debut wasn't at a dealership, it was at the Rose Bowl. Dodge rolled the new car out midway through the 1966 model year, introducing it as the leader of Dodge Rebellion in front of a national television audience watching college football, with big block options on the table, including the 426 Hemi. It was a grand entrance for a car built on the humble Coronet's B-body platform, dressed up with a fastback roofline, 4 bucket seats split by a full-length console, and a wraparound taillight panel that looked like nothing else on the road in 1966. But grand entrances don't guarantee anyone actually buys the car. And for the first Charger, they didn't, not in the numbers Dodge needed. The 1966 model year closed with 37,344 units sold, a modest number against Dodge's total production of roughly 320,000 cars that year. Against the ambition of directly challenging the new Ford Mustang, it was a soft opening at best. Then it got worse. In 1967, sales collapsed to about 15,000 units. That's not a decline. That's a car that had burned through its curiosity and found no lasting audience underneath it. The fastback styling that turned heads at the Rose Bowl wasn't translating into repeat interest or word-of-mouth loyalty. Some later historians described this stretch bluntly as the original Charger's own private birth and death, with fewer than 40,000 first-generation cars sold across its entire 2-year run before Dodge scrapped the whole approach. Inside the company, this had to look like exactly what it was, an expensive gamble that hadn't paid off. The fastback idea was sound. The execution apparently wasn't connecting. Dodge had a name with recognition and a car nobody was buying, and less than 2 years after that triumphant Rose Bowl introduction, something had to change, drastically, or the Charger name would join the Dart Charger package in the list of things Dodge tried once and quietly buried. What happened next is the reason you know this car's name at all. Because in 1968, everything about the Charger changed, and a fight over who actually deserved credit for its shape turned a failing experiment into the best-selling redesign in the company's history. Picture a design studio in Highland Park, sometime in 1966, and a car nobody had officially been told to build. Frank Ruff, the B-body car line manager, was directing clay modelers toward a shape that had no formal program behind it, no scheduled reviews, no committee sign-off. It just kept looking like a winner every time somebody walked past the studio floor. It was shown, still unofficial, to Bob McCurry, Dodge's division vice president. He looked at it once and approved it on the spot, moved it onto a real platform, and sent it to engineering. There had never been a traditional design program for it at all. The man who led that studio team was Richard Sias. Decades later, in a 2015 newspaper interview, Sias said flatly that his team had developed the Charger's full-scale model, and other design historians have gone further, crediting him with the fundamental visual characteristics of the entire redesign. Bill Brownlee, the design chief who would get the public credit for 3 generations of Charger afterward, spent part of that same process trying to steer the studio away from Sias's direction. He lost that argument, but he won a smaller one that turned into his own piece of the legend. Staring at a clay model with the gas filler cap sitting dead center of the new full-width taillight panel, Brownlee reached in, pulled it out, and pressed it into the upper rear fender instead. "That's where it goes," he said. "It stayed there for 3 generations, becoming one of the most recognizable details on the entire car. 2 names, 1 shape, and a credit dispute that's never fully settled. The fundamental design belonged to Sias's studio. The single most famous detail belonged to Brownlee's hand, and history simplified it down to one man's name on the legend. What both men were defending was a total reinvention of the car's body. The fastback silhouette got replaced by a sculpted Coke bottle profile, with an integrated trunk spoiler inspired by Group 7 race cars, hidden headlights tucked behind a full-width grille, and dramatic flying buttress rear roof pillars that made the whole car look like it was moving while parked at the curb. This wasn't a facelift. It was a completely different personality wrapped around the same mechanical bones. Here's the number that tells you whether the gamble worked. Dodge planned production for somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 units for 1968, based on the discouraging 15,000 unit result from the year before. Instead, the company built more than 96,000 Chargers that year. Burt Buchamp, the Dodge executive who'd greenlit the redesign, put the result as plainly as it gets. That was all we could build. Dealers couldn't keep them in stock. Orders kept coming. Hagerty's own verdict on the year captures exactly what happened inside Chrysler. The 1968 Dodge Charger was a revelation in terms of sales for Chrysler. The momentum didn't stop there. 1969 brought 89,199 units, keeping the redesign's success alive for a second straight year. Production dropped to 46,315 in 1970. But that wasn't collapse. It was market fragmentation, because Dodge had launched the Challenger in the meantime and split its own muscle car buyers between two nameplates competing for the same dollar. The 1968 RT, equipped with the 426 Hemi, became the car's high-performance flagship, and 1969 repeated the formula, feeding directly into NASCAR ambitions and street corner legend in equal measure. A car that nearly died at 15,000 units became, within a single model year, the best-selling version of itself the nameplate would ever produce. Built on a shape two men would spend the rest of their careers quietly arguing over who actually drew. Buyers didn't care who got the credit. They just wanted the shape. And that same shape, tuned for speed instead of just looks, was about to go to war on the one stage where looks meant nothing at all. The NASCAR Superspeedway. Somewhere in the wind tunnels and back rooms of Chrysler Engineering in 1968, a simple problem had become an obsession. The Charger's beautiful new Coke bottle body, the same one CS's Studio and Brownlee had fought each other over, was creating too much aerodynamic drag at superspeedway velocities to win consistently against Ford and Mercury on NASCAR's biggest tracks. The answer arrived in 1969 wearing the name Charger Daytona, and it looked like nothing Dodge had ever put on a showroom floor. A sharply pointed nose cone extended nearly 2 feet in front of the car's original grille. A flush, laid-back windshield reduced turbulence. And rising from the trunk was a wing tall enough that it had to clear the trunk lid when it opened, mounted on struts that looked more aircraft than automobile. None of it was styling for its own sake. Every inch of the Daytona's shape existed to solve one specific problem: NASCAR homologation, and the raw physics of going faster in a straight line than anyone else on the circuit. It worked, and it worked so completely that NASCAR itself had to respond. The Daytona's aerodynamic package, along with rival aero specials from Ford and Mercury, pushed speeds high enough during the era's so-called aero wars that NASCAR changed its own rulebook to limit exactly this kind of extreme bodywork. A street-legal production car had gotten fast enough to force a sanctioning body to rewrite its regulations. That doesn't happen often in American racing history, and it happened because of a Charger. 1970 brought the Charger 500, a bridge model that carried the Daytona's aerodynamic learning back into a more street-oriented package, keeping the NASCAR heritage alive in a form regular buyers could actually park in a driveway. The following years brought a slow retreat from that peak. The 1971 Charger RT Hemi, with its distinctive Ramcharger hood scoop, stood as the last true big block brute before insurance rates and tightening regulation caught up with the whole muscle car era. By 1972, the Rally 340 Magnum trim showed exactly where the industry was heading, smaller displacement engines standing in for the big blocks that had defined the previous 4 years. The Daytona itself never sold in huge numbers, and when it was new, plenty of people thought the nose cone and rear wing looked absurd bolted onto a road car. Today that verdict has completely reversed. Original Daytonas are among the rarest and most valuable Chargers in existence, held up in museum collections and commanding extraordinary prices whenever one crosses an auction block. The Daytona proved the Charger could win on a superspeedway in front of NASCAR officials. What happened next proved it could win somewhere far bigger, on movie screens and television sets in nearly every American living room. By the mid-1970s, the Charger had already done something almost no other car could claim. It had become a movie star before it had even finished being a sales success. The moment most collectors point to first is 1968, when a black Charger became the villain's car in a single chase sequence through the hills of San Francisco, squaring off against Steve McQueen's Mustang in a film called Bullitt. Cars.com puts it plainly, noting the 1968 and 1969 Chargers are best known for their movie and television appearances, and that chase is the reason why. It wasn't a starring role. The Charger didn't even win. But the sight of that Coke bottle body diving through intersections at speed burned itself into the American imagination in a way that no advertisement ever could have. Then came television, and a very different kind of fame. Starting in 1979, an orange 1969 Charger. Calling itself the General Lee, jumped creek beds, barn roofs, and police roadblocks every week on the Dukes of Hazzard, its horn blaring the first notes of Dixie before every stunt. Producers went through hundreds of Chargers over the course of the show's run, wrecking car after car for a single jump that lasted seconds on screen. For an entire generation of American kids, the Charger wasn't a Mopar engineering achievement. It was the car that flew. That kind of fame carried real weight and real complication. The General Lee's roof carried Confederate flag imagery that has made the car controversial in later decades, even as replica builders and collectors continue to restore and display tribute versions of it today. The car's legacy is genuinely split, adored by people who grew up watching it jump, and uncomfortable history for others watching the same footage now. Hollywood didn't stop reaching for the Charger once the Dukes went off the air. Decades later, Dominic Toretto's supercharged Charger became the signature machine of the Fast and the Furious franchise, introducing the nameplate to an entirely new generation of moviegoers who had never seen the original show in first run. A retrospective piece on the car's cultural footprint sums up exactly what these two eras did together. Hollywood, it argues, cemented the Charger's fame, and its appearances in Bullitt and the Fast and the Furious films made audiences fall in love, further boosting its legendary status. Think about what that means. Older viewers watched that Bullitt chase live, in theaters, in 1968. Their grandchildren met the same nameplate decades later, on a different screen, in a different decade, with a supercharger instead of a Hemi under the hood. Two completely different generations, connected by one car. Fame like that doesn't fade quietly. But the company that built the car wasn't thinking about movie stardom in the years right after. It was thinking about surviving a fuel crisis, and the Charger was about to trade its muscle car reputation for something softer. By 1971, the same car that had forced NASCAR to rewrite its rulebook was already quietly changing into something its earlier owners might not have recognized. That year brought the third-generation fuselage body, a rounder, more integrated design that folded the Charger and Coronet lines together into one shared shape. It wasn't a bad-looking car, but it was a different mission. The 1971 RT Hemi, with its distinctive Ram Charger hood scoop, was really the last gasp of the big block brute era, and the 1972 Rally 340 Magnum made the direction obvious. Smaller engines, tighter regulation, and a market that had stopped rewarding raw displacement the way it had just 3 years earlier. Then, in 1975, Dodge made the pivot complete. The Charger's body was shared directly with the Chrysler Cordoba, and the car reoriented itself entirely around personal luxury rather than performance. The primary expression of that shift was the Charger SE, a trim built around comfort features and plush trim rather than quarter-mile times. It continued through 1976 and into 1978, the last year the traditional rear-drive Charger would exist in that form. Here's the strange part. By raw sales volume, the 1973 Charger was actually the best-selling Charger of the entire 20th century, with total sales around 108,000 units that year. But more than 60% of those cars carried non-high performance engines. In enthusiast memory, that number doesn't read as a triumph. It reads as proof of exactly how far the car had drifted from the identity that made it famous in the first place. Volume was up. Character was gone. Allpar's account of this stretch captures the tone historians use when summing up the whole 13-year original run. Across that entire span, slightly more than 710,000 Chargers were built before the name was retired in the late 1970s. And the way that history is usually written carries real regret in it. The name survived. The Daytona's spirit, the RT Hemi's spirit, did not survive with it. What had started as a lie about an idea car that Dodge had already approved, and grown into a genuine icon by 1969, had spent the first half of the 1970s slowly turning into a plush coupe wearing a muscle car's old badge. By 1978, that badge disappeared from Dodge showrooms entirely. It wasn't a redesign this time, it was a cancellation, and what came back to replace it a few years later would test the loyalty of everyone who remembered what a Charger used to be. The Charger name came back in 1982, and almost nobody who loved the 1968 car recognized what they were looking at. This new Charger was a front-wheel drive hatchback built on the Dodge Omni and Horizon platform, small, efficient, and about as far from a 426 Hemi fastback as an American car could get, while still wearing the same three letters on its trunk lid. Dealer histories describe this as a front-drive experiment, an attempt to keep some version of performance alive inside a compact, fuel-conscious package that made sense in the post-fuel crisis market. Late in the run, the 1986 Charger 2.2 leaned on a modest 2.2-liter four-cylinder as the line wound down toward its end. There's a detail that tells you almost everything about how this era is remembered inside the industry itself. When automotive design historians went looking for people willing to talk about this generation of Charger, they came up nearly empty. Car Design News put it directly. We couldn't find any designers to quote, as apparently few were willing to speak about it. That's not a technical footnote. That's a car nobody wanted their name attached to years later, even the people who built it. But even inside that quiet embarrassment, one version earned real respect. In 1987, Carroll Shelby put his name and his tuning expertise behind the Shelby Charger GLHS, commonly explained as standing for Goes Like Hell S'more. It was turbocharged, sharpened in the suspension, and genuinely quick by the standards of the era's hot hatch class. For one brief model year, the Charger name meant something again, on a much smaller scale than 1969. But real. It didn't last. Charger production stopped completely after the 1987 model year, and this time the silence went on far longer than the gap between 1978 and 1982. Nearly 2 decades passed with no new Charger on any showroom floor anywhere in America. The name lived on almost entirely through reruns of the Dukes of Hazzard and the enduring reputation of the 1968 to 1970 cars, kept alive by owners, restorers, and collectors rather than by anything Dodge was currently selling. In 1999, Dodge floated a Charger RT concept that hinted at a modern revival, but it went nowhere near a production line. The nameplate had now died twice. Once quietly, fading into a Cordoba-badged luxury coupe, and once almost completely, vanishing from Dodge's lineup for the better part of 20 years, while the culture that remembered it moved on without a single new car to attach itself to. Whatever came next would have to answer a real question. After 2 cancellations, Did anyone still want a Charger at all? The answer arrived in 2005, and it came in a shape almost nobody expected. Dodge reintroduced the Charger as an all-new model for the 2006 model year. And this time it wasn't a fastback and it wasn't a hatchback. It was a four-door sedan built on the rear-wheel drive LX platform shared with the Chrysler 300, with an available all-wheel drive option for buyers in colder climates. Mopar Connection frames the moment precisely. 19 years after putting the nameplate to rest for a second time, Dodge reintroduced the Charger in 2005 as an all-new model for the 2006 model year. Traditionalists were not happy. A four-door Charger struck plenty of longtime fans as a contradiction in terms. A nameplate built on a two-door fastback now wearing rear doors and a trunk built for grocery runs. But the car found its footing fast. Cars.com describes it as an unexpected return, closely related mechanically to the new Dodge Magnum wagon, and within a short stretch of model years it had built genuine popularity as a family-friendly muscle sedan, rather than a pure two-door performance car. The lineup expanded quickly across trims: SE, SXT, RT, a nostalgic Daytona RT Special Edition that borrowed its name directly from the 1969 Aero car, and dedicated police pursuit models that put Chargers into law enforcement fleets across the country. That last detail that mattered more than it might seem. Once Charger pursuit cars became common in police departments nationwide, the nameplate went from something people saw occasionally at a car show to something they saw every single day in their rearview mirror, whether they wanted to or not. This generation set a template the Charger would follow for the next 2 decades. Big, bold, genuinely powerful, and still practical enough to be somebody's only car. It didn't chase the two-door fastback identity of 1968. It built an entirely new identity instead, one where 4 doors and real horsepower weren't a contradiction anymore. That template would go on to carry the Charger through its longest and most successful modern chapter. But first, it's worth looking at exactly what the market has decided this whole story is actually worth. Here's where the emotional story turns into hard evidence, because the collector market doesn't lie about what people actually value, and the numbers on 1968 to 1970 Chargers tell a specific, complicated story. A 2025 Hemmings market analysis shows average values for 1968 to 1970. Charger RT models fell from about 116,000 at the end of 2021 to about 103,000 at the end of 2024, an 11% decline. That sounds like bad news until you compare it against the broader collector car market, which dropped by roughly 20% over that same stretch. The Charger RT lost less than half of what the overall market lost, and at the top end, real transactions back that resilience up. A numbers matching 1970 Charger RT, fitted with the 446-pack engine, a 4-speed manual, and the Super Track pack option, sold for $297,000. Non-RT Chargers from the same era have actually gone the other direction entirely, climbing from just under $60,000 to around $78,000 in average value. Hagerty puts excellent condition 1968 to 1970. Chargers at roughly $91,450 today, out of an original 1968 production run of 96,100 units, with only about 40,000 of those built as high-performance RT models. That scarcity is exactly why estate sales and long-held collections keep setting new benchmarks whenever a genuine Hemi car reaches auction. The modern cars are behaving in a way almost nobody expected from a mass-produced sedan. 3-year-old Hellcat Chargers are routinely listed near their original sticker prices, defying the depreciation curve every other modern sedan follows without exception. Analysts tie that directly to the car's growing inclusion in Hagerty's own muscle car index, treating a factory sedan barely old enough to need new tires as a genuine collector asset. Dodge Garage's own assessment of the broader LX platform makes the point directly. These cars have become more than just transportation, with some already recognized as bona fide collector's items with impressive performance, style, and substantial resale value. And then came the ending nobody at Dodge chose voluntarily. In November of 2021, Stellantis announced that 2023 would be the final model year for the LX platform, Charger and Challenger, citing tightening EPA emission standards that made continuing the V8-powered lineup impossible under the company's future compliance targets. On August 15, 2022, that decision became official and permanent. The Brampton assembly plant, which had built these cars for years, began retooling for electrified successors. Dodge answered the cancellation the way it always seems to answer cancellations, with one last celebration. The 2023 Last Call run, including a special edition called the King Daytona, turned the government-pressured end of the gas-powered Charger into a farewell tour instead of a quiet shutdown. The market has made its verdict clear on every era of this car, from six-figure Hemis to sedans holding their sticker price 3 years out. What's left is the chapter that made all of that possible in the first place, the one where a four-door family car quietly became one of the most powerful production sedans ever sold in America. In 2011, the Charger got its sharpest redesign yet, the LD generation, with tightened bodywork, a new 8-speed automatic, and a run that would carry the nameplate all the way through 2023. Dealer histories simply call this stretch the Hellcat era, and once you understand what Dodge put under the hood, you understand why no other name fit. It started in 2015. The Charger SRT Hellcat arrived with a 6.2-liter supercharged Hemi 5.8, rated at 707 horsepower, a number that had no business appearing on a window sticker attached to a car with 4 doors, a back seat, and a trunk big enough for a week of groceries. Mopar Connection didn't hedge about what that meant. The Hellcat was declared as the fastest sedan money could buy when it debuted, capable of running past 200 miles per hour and covering a quarter mile in the 10-second range with the right tires mounted, creating an instant classic in the process. Picture the exact moment that number became real to an ordinary driver rather than a spec sheet. A stoplight in suburban Michigan sometime in 2015. A Charger Hellcat sitting next to whatever else happens to be there, a Corvette, a BMW, doesn't matter. The light turns green. The Hellcat's supercharger winds through the intake before the tires even bite, and by the time the other car's driver processes what just happened, the Hellcat is already 3 car lengths gone. A 4-door sedan with a car seat anchor in the back walking away from vehicles that cost twice as much and carry half as many doors. That's not an exaggeration built for effect. That's 707 horsepower doing exactly what 707 horsepower does. In a body shape everyone assumed belonged to a rental car counter, not a drag strip. Dodge kept pushing. The 2016 SRT 392 offered a naturally aspirated 6.4-liter Hemi as a lower-cost alternative below the Hellcat's supercharged ceiling. In 2017, the TA and Daytona packages reached back into the nameplate's own 1969 history, putting historic names on modern hardware for buyers who wanted the heritage alongside the horsepower. Then in 2020, the Hellcat widebody arrived, flaring the fenders and widening the stance to put all that power down more effectively on the street, and the following year, 2021, Dodge pushed the number even further with the Charger SRT Hellcat Red Eye, rated at 797 horsepower, described by multiple outlets as possibly the fastest sedan in the entire world. Think about what that lineup actually was, side by side. The same LD generation Charger came as a modest V6 commuter car for a fleet buyer, as a Scat Pack 392 for a weekend track day enthusiast, as a police pursuit cruiser parked outside a courthouse, and as a 797 horsepower Red Eye capable of humiliating cars 10 times its price. One body, one nameplate, Every version of what a car could be to an American driver, wearing the same badge Dodge had once tested as a fake idea back in 1965 just to see if anyone would notice. By 2023, Stellantis had already made the call, but Dodge made sure the final chapter looked nothing like a surrender. The last call specials, including the King Daytona, sent the Hellcat generation out exactly the way the Daytona had gone into NASCAR in 1969. Loud, aerodynamic, unapologetic, and completely aware of its own place in the car's history. A nameplate that had been killed by its own sales chart in 1967, killed by its own parent company's luxury pivot in the late 1970s, killed again by 2 decades of silence after 1987, went out for a third time, not because nobody wanted it anymore, but because Stellantis said tightening emissions rules made the V8 impossible to keep building. Every other ending had been the market's decision. This one was regulatory. And that difference is exactly why the Hellcat era doesn't feel like a museum piece. It feels like something that got taken away before it was finished. There's a question this whole history leaves hanging. While the Charger kept getting reinvented, resurrected, and pushed to 797 horsepower, its own showroom sibling was living through an entirely different kind of ending. One where Dodge didn't bring the name back twice. It killed.